Live from SABC Auckland Park headquarters, welcome to this evening's edition of The Watchdog. My name is Vuyo Mvogo and thank you for tuning in. On the show tonight, more arrests on day 2 of the clashes between the Dudula movement and foreign nationals as uneasy calm returns to the Alexandra township after police send in reinforcements. But how long will the peace last? We'll also look at a proposal to pay mayors according to performance. How will that work? What are the pros and cons? And as the world celebrates International Women's Day, we look at lived experiences of women from different walks of South African life. And that will be before our activists and academics panel weighs in on the issues the stories throw up. The Watchdog starts now. Well, we start with this update on the story we discussed at length yesterday. 5 more people have been arrested for public violence and incitement in Alexandra, north of Johannesburg. This after a second day of unrest in the area. Tires were set alight in several areas, allegedly by the Dudula movement, which demands that undocumented foreign nationals leave the country. SABC News senior reporter Griselda Lewis and video journalist Tulo Monare have been in the township monitoring developments there.
It was a bright start for some of the brave ones, while others chose to keep their doors closed in fear of further violence.
Send the army. We don't need the Metro and SAP. They are not scared. They torment them. They are not scared. The Metro and SAP are not allowed to open fire, and if they do open fire, it's waist below to shoot and injure.
There was a stronger police presence in the area today, and it wasn't long. There are now pockets of violence. As you can see, tires have been set alight here. This is on the other side of Alexandra, near the Boxer Superstore. Remember that there's a large police presence that is in the area, but very much deployed towards the area where we saw the attacks between South Africans and foreign nationals yesterday. Taxi operators were forced to clear the roads as violence spread to other parts of the township.
We are worried because they will repossess our taxis if we can't pay. We're here for business and this is disrupting us.
It wasn't long before more arrests were effected.
The community doesn't want to support lawlessness, they want to support law and order. So therefore, these taxis, as they drive around, if they come there before the police, they remove before the police came. So there's a greater collaboration today between the taxis and the police.
Only half of the businesses in the area, in particular, small businesses owned by foreign nationals, opened today over fear of more attacks. Police remain on scene. Griselda Lewis, SABC News in Alexandra in Johannesburg.
And Griselda continues to monitor that situation and will keep updating us. For now, though, let's move to this other story that got people talking today. A proposal that municipal councillors and speakers be paid according to their performance. Well, to help us make sense of it all is Dr. Tina Nzo from the Public Affairs Research Institute. Dr. Nzo, good evening. Thanks very much for your time. I'm wondering what went through your mind when you heard this proposal.
Hi, Vuyo and the viewers. I would like to say that it was quite interesting to hear that we're moving towards that direction, taking into account that we're coming from a very precarious situation in local government, where there has been an outcry when it comes to councillors, particularly those councillors who are appointed as office bearers in municipalities, who have been seen not to be performing for these past few years. And there are many indicators that have really led us to that understanding of whether really we should now be focusing on whether we should start evaluating councillors' performance before we even think about electing them back into office. So I find that a very interesting move, taking into account that we are faced with a very dire situation of a failing local government in South Africa.
I mean, it was interesting, speaking to some of the officials who are in the know about this proposal. We're saying, well, as a matter of fact, the Kokta minister, in consultation with SALGA, actually has the authority in terms of the Systems Act to regulate or prescribe general key performance indicators for local government.
Yeah, absolutely correct. I mean, SALGA has a very important role to play there, as a representative of local government, which is representing all the local government institutions in the country. And obviously, when it comes to the amendments of what it is that we need to take into account when we talk about reforms of local government, they have that authority to actually institutionalize measures that would ensure that we fix local government moving forward, because one of the key areas that we've been talking about of lately as part of the reforms is issues around professionalizing local government. Of course, this is still a very wide concept that needs to be tested, but bringing in issues related to performance management and performance appraisals of political representatives is something that obviously needs to be explored at this point in time. So I guess right now it's about exploring that concept and understanding exactly how it's going to mean for councillors who are politically elected representatives of the public.
One wonders, though, whether it should actually lead to, improved responsiveness, resulting in these people responding to the needs of communities, given the fact that these people come via political processes that often have very little, if anything, to do with a person's ability or performance even.
In fact, that's why I'm saying that it would be very interesting to see how it will actually pan out, because one of the things that we need to remember, if you're going to be introducing performance agreements for councillors, even councillors who are appointed as political office bearers, you need to take into account that these councillors have been elected by the public. Therefore, as elected representatives, they are accountable to the electorate. So if you introduce that kind of system, then how do we ensure that the public also features in that process of determining exactly what it is that councillors should be appraised on, because councillors fundamentally have a responsibility of representing the interest of the electorate and their communities and their constituencies. And secondly, from the understanding of the councillors' roles and responsibilities, one of their key responsibilities is to ensure that they provide oversight, but also ensure that they facilitate public participation, and also ensure that these ward committees that they preside over, they sit and they deliberate on the developmental interest and the developmental role that they should be playing in their communities. So hence I'm saying it will be very interesting to see if whether these kinds of performance appraisals will be actually looking at, the social contract, because councillors, when they get elected, they sign what we call social contracts, more than performance agreements. They sign the social contracts with their communities and the electorate. So then the determining factor in terms of how we will actually measure their performance against social contracts will be interesting, in the sense that will the communities and the constituencies and the electorate will have a voice in determining these factors.
Well, as we all know, in many instances, they are found wanting when it comes to, monitoring, when it comes to, approval of budgets, getting clean audits. They don't play their oversight roles. But the reason they are able to get away with it is precisely because there's often very little, if any, appetite from their political parties or political principals, in actually in ensuring that they monitor, the performance. Because even before you can actually, have rules, it's something that should be happening in any case. In other words, you don't need to put, new rules for this to happen, but it has been happening. Do you think that there'll be, appetite this time around from political parties and political principals?
That will also be interesting to see whether they will be keen, because if you remember, not so long ago, the governing party, the ANC, introduced what we call taking oath of office, but also just taking oath of office is not enough. They made their councillors to actually sign, their performance agreements within the political party prism, within that framework. But again, as the public, we don't necessarily get to understand exactly what goes into those agreements and pledges that they made with their political parties, because they have never really been made public. So in this spectrum, it will also be very interesting to see if whether are these political parties ready, to reveal exactly what kind of benchmarking are citizens supposed to make in comparison to these agreements that they signed with them before they went into office. But on the other end, we also need to take into account that we also have political office bearers who are given a huge task and responsibility of political management. I know this term is not often used, but I see their roles as part of the political management system, where they provide the leadership and the oversight over very key departments in the municipality. For example, you have a mayor, you've got deputy mayors in bigger metros, you also have the speaker's office, the chief whips, and you also have members of the mayoral committee. And most of them, some of them actually are full-time, paid members who are supposed to preside over their committees and provide the strategic leadership and oversight over these committees when it comes to policy making. So on that front, yes, there is an argument to be made if whether a certain MMC, a member of the mayoral committee or portfolio committee chairperson, is actually executing the roles and responsibilities that they're supposed to execute in terms of providing that leadership and oversight over the administration, because that involves quite hefty day-to-day work that needs to be done. But on the other hand, you just mentioned issues around accountability related to all the poor performances that we've been seeing emanating from the different municipalities and that have been expressed, through the very poor audit outcomes that have been shown over the years, and they've not really gotten any better. In fact, some municipalities have gone worse, to the extent where these municipalities had to be put under Section 136. So those remedial actions, those are some of the things that we need to see coming out from these political office bearers who are given that responsibility. And again, was probably the exploration of bringing in a performance management perspective into that spectrum of the city or a local municipality or district municipality might actually put these political office bearers on their toes. And also taking into account that we have one of the most interesting perspectives on consequence management. Will these performance agreements result in consequence management? What will happen? Will they be evaluated quarterly, annually, interim within their political office term? And if a councillor is found not to be performing, will there be consequences for their poor performance?
Well, another matter, of course, this throws up is, these municipalities aren't the same. We have rich municipalities that can afford to do a lot of things and are perhaps stopped from, those things actually happening because people just, there's no political will, or there's corruption and other things. But on the other, there's a reality of poorer municipalities, especially those in far-flung areas who have no revenue base whatsoever, but also have very small budgets and often have much bigger backlogs and problems than the well-off or better resourced municipalities. So one wonders that in those instances, how do you then come up with a kind of criteria of measuring performance that will be fair even to those who don't have resources? In other words, they aren't delivering because, they don't want to, or there's no will, or there's corruption. It's purely or often because, there simply isn't money, in those areas of our country.
Absolutely. That's a very pertinent argument to raise, because some of these councillors have come into the new term of administration inheriting a plethora of service delivery backlogs, a plethora of institutional issues that are also related to the capacity of the administration to actually execute their functions. But other municipalities are literally bankrupt, and other municipalities don't even have the ability to raise revenue and also balance their expenditure. So there are these plethora of factors that we need to bring in, where, of course, a one-size-fits-all when it comes to the performance management system of councillors needs to be given greater consideration, because you'll be setting them up for failure. So those are some of the things that we need to carefully think about. But one of the things that I really want to press upon is the fact that, councillors, they are accountable to the electorate. So how do you factor that in? Will the electorate be able to come into this process and say that, according to us, as the electorate, as communities, this is what we are expecting our councillors to deliver? And what kind of factors will determine that? Because some councillors are highly dependent on the responsiveness of the administration, particularly when it comes to service delivery. So the agility around service delivery, is a factor that we need to think about, where there is this dependency in this relationship between councillors and the administration. So there is a probability that we might be setting up councillors for failure. And that kind of failure is something that will be a reoccurrence unless we tighten the screws in the administration, where we actually say that, councillors' performance must only be determined according to these basic functions, rather than trying to link them up with the service delivery outputs, which they absolutely have no control over.
In fact, we're going to end this interview here, but because of what you've just raised, I have to squeeze in one more question, because I'm reminded of this by what you've just said. If you take officials, for example, your municipal managers and their unit or divisional heads, they are subjected to some kind of a regime that ensures that they actually perform their tasks in line with their job descriptions and so on. And that in part was a justification for many of them, especially the metros and the bigger municipalities, for them to be paid competitive salaries. But if you look at what has been happening over the years, where there's political interference, and in other instances, people who simply don't qualify get to be municipal managers or get to lead, divisions or units within municipalities, in spite of them not deserving. And the reason that has been happening is because the politicians are able to manipulate the system. And one wonders if this proposal, if it goes through, won't just be a box-ticking exercise, given our experiences. You take the ANC, which you mentioned. There was a process of appointing candidates for the party's candidates for mayor. People have complained about that process, how it didn't yield the kind of results many people who would have been privy or would have been part of those processes thought it should. There were question marks around a lot of candidates. You look also at their list process, which many people complained about. You'll recall in the run-up to the November 1 election, there were protests all over the place, which was resolved by Didi Mabuza, the party's deputy president, and other officials saying, look, let's look at this after the election. We will be able, where things went wrong, we don't mind going back to, having by-elections again. So, there is that problem too. In other words, you can have, a very good and regime in place which supposedly prevents these things from happening, but experience has taught us these things have actually happened in spite of those, of what is supposedly a tight regime.
In fact, that is one of the biggest problems that we have operating under a local government system that is so partisan in its nature, where you find that, processes that are supposed to be disentangled from party political issues, they get, blurred into the administrative processes of institutions such as local government. I mean, you mentioned just one important thing that actually made me think about, the idea of actually interviewing mayoral candidates and also members of the mayoral committee in order to test their leadership qualities and abilities, and also looking at their proficiencies, if whether they will be able to carry a municipal institution forward. We know exactly what happened, that there were certain candidates who had gone through those processes, but because of the partisanship nature and also, the verification of party politics in relation to, the factions that have always been there, particularly in the ANC, that have really blurred that process, where you find that candidates which actually do not meet the criterion, they are able, to surface in this process and become the mayors. Some of these mayors are not even popular mayors within those communities or constituencies. So yes, there is that verification of a process where partisan politics have always caused, a messy kind of situation in local government. And again, this also comes back to the issue of the administration. One of the outcries that have come out very clearly, which have pushed for civil society organizations to say that we need a reform when it comes to professionalization of local government, where we can start disentangling partisan politics from the administration. Because like what you said, municipal managers, senior managers, once their fixed term contracts come to an end, you find that some of them, they come back to the municipality and they are reappointed. And that reappointment, does it really speak to the kind of performance that they have delivered over their term of office? Is it really linked to that, or is it linked to, partisan politics that they have become part of in the whole process of local government? So that is a very important issue that we need to address. How do we disentangle the administration? How do you actually remove the administration from partisan politics that have contributed towards the dire situation that we have in local government? And again, just to even go back to an interesting, perspective, now that we see that local government is operating under coalition formations. So if you bring in that kind of performance regime, are these coalition political parties or partnerships that have been formed, will they come to an agreement to say that as a political coalition, these are the things that we want to look at in relation to our councillors that we appoint in the various positions in the political management perspective of the council? Or will they be able to say that, there are certain things that we need to consider out of this? So a blanket approach will be very detrimental. But again, like I'm emphasizing, we need to start disentangling local government from the partisan political system that we have in order to really crystallize exactly what it is that we are looking for in this performance management system that we are trying to set up.
Dr. Tinanzo, thanks very much for your time and insights this evening. She's from the Public Affairs Research Institute, responding to that proposal that municipal councillors and speakers and those people be paid according to their performance, an idea that's being canvassed at this stage. I'm sure there'll be a lot of reaction. What do you think? You can, of course, tweet us, write to us, and tell us what you think of this proposal. After the break, it's International Women's Day. What's there to celebrate? Mark International Women's Day. Some parties say patriarchy is still entrenched in the country, while others say perpetrators of gender-based violence are always known to their victims.
The president and his backers are doing all they can to stop the JC process that recommended the appointment of a first female chief justice in the country.
The ANC and the Women's League have always stood at the forefront of the transformation of society and firmly located the role and position of women in a broader struggle for the liberation of blacks in general and Africans in particular. Sorry. There can be no doubt that the gender question is firmly on the national agenda.
Perpetrators of violence against women are not some monsters out there. They are colleagues, they are leaders in society, and some are our very own honorable members.
Well, some excerpts there from that snap debate that took place in our parliament a little earlier. Now, as women across the world celebrate this International Women's Day, should the question be asked whether they remain guests in a men's world? Despite wide-ranging gender equity policies, women still face an uphill battle in the workplace. An industry that is especially tough to break into is the actuarial sector.
From basic arithmetic, matric math is the final step of basic education for these learners. For these 7 girls from Curtis Nkondo School of Specialization, this class is a gateway to a dream career. Koketso Mutsa and her classmates hope to become qualified actuarial scientists one day.
When I stumbled upon the actual sciences blog, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like a description of me in her job description form.
I went to study actuarial science mostly because I'm very passionate about problem solving, number one. Number two, I love money.
While a matric pass is not enough to gain university entrance, they will have to achieve at least a distinction in matric maths. In 2016, over 8,000 learners managed to achieve a distinction. This nearly halved in 2019 with just over 4,000 learners. But despite these stats and the Department of Basic Education saying that the needle is not moving, there is little to dissuade these young bright minds. And it was the same tenacity that saw Memory Zimba move from the classroom to lecture hall and now the boardroom as a qualified actuary. Despite Zimba's many accolades, she says the field remains male-dominated.
I remember sitting in my desk in the actuarial department, and somebody whose job I just took over, because they had moved over to a new company and were coming in to audit, came to the actuarial department and asked me if I was the secretary. So I laughed it off. But afterwards, I was so upset with myself because that was not a joke.
But despite reaching the pinnacle of her career, the total number of qualified women actuaries in the country remains at less than 30%. Mahla Kokoman, SABC News, Johannesburg.
Well, stories of women who are trying to break the glass ceiling there. Well, here's another story. A young woman from Vleifontein near Louis Trichardt in Limpopo is running a life-altering project. Rotondo Musita runs one of the biggest trash recycling projects in the province. The project, dubbed Trash Converters, employs 17 people, mainly women. It recycles almost everything from plastic to bottles. Musita has earned the nickname Trash Queen from community members.
From the queen of beauty to the queen of recycling, Musita is doing what her peers can only frown upon. The 3-time Miss Mamelodi Sundowns beauty pageant participant is turning trash into treasure trove. With mega resources and little funding from her parents, the 27-year-old MBA student started the project back in 2018. Musita said she tapped into the recycling space after realizing it was not popular in Limpopo. She processes and packages hundreds of discarded materials, selling them to markets in Johannesburg.
The reason for starting this company was because in Limpopo by the time only 1.8% of recyclables were being recycled. So I realized that there's a gap. And also with the high unemployment rate, we realized that if this is something we can do to bring about a change in society, why not?
Project came as a lifeline for some in the poverty-stricken community. For the regular person, these are heaps and heaps of trash and unpleasant odor. But for these people working here, it's bread on the table.
I've been looking for some time, and it's a good place. We're doing recycling. I've learned a lot.
Musita aims to acquire more sophisticated machinery to expand her operations. Lutiando Bobori, SABC News, Vleefontein.
Well, for a conversation on some of the issues raised in those stories, please welcome Nondumiso Ntsibande, who is the Country Director for International NGO Action Aid. Salima Valiani is an author and independent researcher. Phakama Njongwana is a professor of social policy at the Nelson Mandela University and also serves on a Presidential Social Policy Commission. Good evening to both of you. Thank you very much for your time and happy Women's Day.
Good evening, Vuyo.
Thank you very much, Vuyo, and thank you very much. And thank you for.
I'm going to start with gender-based violence, which was raised by one of the MPs in that snap debate in Parliament, was saying perpetrators of gender-based violence are not some monsters out there. They are our own family members, colleagues, and our very own honorable members. I mean, we've been going through hell over the past few years. The cases of your Karabo Mukwenas, your Uinene Mkhwetyanas, your Tsegofaso Pules, and many, 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 many more. And this is refusing to go away. And Pagano?
Yeah, I mean, it is tragic. I mean, even though as a country we have ratified significant protocols and treaties in respect of the protection of women's rights, we still somehow a lot of times fail to account, as to. So our monitoring and evaluation systems fail really in terms of holding people accountable to gender-based violence issues, which can start with the psychological, right? Where psychological violence is not really seen as violence, and then it can escalate to a physical violence with women just really bearing the brunt of that. So I think that in terms of accountability through monitoring and evaluation strategies and implementation, we can move forward as a country in protecting women's rights. Of course, with the twin pandemic, so to speak, of COVID-19, and as a result, people who don't have jobs and remain at home and depend on their partners are susceptible to gender-based violence as well. Again, as a country, the issue of protection of socioeconomic rights comes up, so that women do feel that they have the right to say no to sexual violence, for example, and not just be abused so that they hit their children or their children can go to school. It shouldn't be, there shouldn't be that tension of meeting basic rights and sexual violence.
Nondomiso, I mean, your organization is big. I mean, across the world, you know, you have, I'm sure you are able to share notes with your colleagues from other jurisdictions across the world. Do we have examples of people who have a better grip you know, on femicide and gender-based violence, and who are perhaps doing or pioneering or trying out things that are perhaps working a little bit better than, you know, for instance, is the case in South Africa?
Thank you very much, Fuyo. And indeed, I can share that, you know, we've done a number of studies that we're looking at, I think, the impact of COVID-19 on young women in 4 countries, and that's India, Ghana, Kenya, and of course, South Africa. And I think one of the things that actually came out strongly from the study are the escalating rates of gender-based violence. And I must say that gender-based violence is a challenge across the world, across various jurisdictions. But I want to bring it back home just to talk about some of our significant gains, because I think it's important to recognize that as we talk about building a more sustainable tomorrow in line with the theme of International Women's Day. Now, you will note, I think, the adoption of the National Strategic Plan on Gender-Based Violence and Femicide. And I think we really need to recognize that as a significant gain, is something that we have been calling for. Many women have been calling for across the country, and we are happy to finally see this document being passed. But moreover, let me just add, Vuyo, what we are seeing again, and I think there's reason to actually acknowledge this, is that we are seeing much more stronger partnerships between civil society organizations, government, and private sector. And I think for the first time in a long time, we were seeing far more corporates engaging in campaigns around gender-based violence, putting in money towards addressing gender-based violence. I mean, rarely today will you go into a mall or any shop without seeing some kind of messaging around gender-based violence. I must also add, for many years, we've talked about the lack of political willingness. And I think we need to acknowledge some of the changes that we're seeing at this point. I mean, if you listen to the president's speech, almost every time he talks about the issue of gender-based violence. And this is something that we hadn't seen as much previously. So I really, really, really want to acknowledge these gains, but to also then say, Vuyo, that we still have so much to do. The adoption of the NSP itself is just the starting point. It does call for a multi-sectoral approach. It calls for all of us to actually come in to address gender-based violence. I do also want to acknowledge again, Vuyo, the passing of the amendments, the Domestic Violence Amendment Act, and others that are really geared towards addressing gender-based violence. And I think there's a huge task in us at this point, conscientizing communities around some of the progressive provisions that we are actually seeing in this amendment. But of course, as I said, you know, there's still so much more to be done, because the reality of the matter is we are still very much seeing huge underreporting rates across the country, and it will take a collective. I was a part of a discussion this afternoon where we are talking about collaboration. It will take collaboration amongst different stakeholders for us to actually address gender-based violence, and of course to work towards a much more sustainable tomorrow.
Salima, I mean, both Parama and Nondomiso are correct, isn't it? Yes, we may have we've made progress. There's a national strategic plan. Perhaps more resources are being put into, you know, the fight against femicide and gender-based violence than has perhaps been the case before. And for instance, I mean, the signing of the 3 pieces of legislation by the president recently. But as Nondomiso was emphasizing, there are roles that need to be played by so many people for, you know, that strategic plan to work and for change to actually come.
Good evening to everybody, especially all the women out there. Happy International Women's Day. Thank you, Vuyo, for the question, and to the other panelists for the discussion. I want to bring it to something more day-to-day, in which we all have a role to play, as you're saying, Vuyo, but which we are not talking about, which is not only the issue of women, but it tends to become the burden of women. And that is the question of the care economy. I will soon be releasing a major research study on the care economy in Africa. So it's an Africa-wide study. And what I'm doing there is looking at how we are supporting as a society the various aspects of care in society. Now we know that that means everything from giving birth to children, raising infants, taking care of children after school, before they start school, caring for the elderly, caring for people living with disabilities. We know that in Africa, there are estimates that 40% of the population is living with disabilities. Who is doing that work? And we know, especially through COVID, that it is women who not only lost their jobs, but were also the ones doing the schooling at home, caring for the children who couldn't go to school during lockdown, caring for people with COVID who didn't have resources to be cared for elsewhere. So this issue is a major one, and I want to stress that not only is this work that needs to be shared in society, it is not being shared currently, but it also needs support from the state. This is work that must be redistributed through the public sector, and we have very much to learn and to build in the continent. We need to raise this issue with our brothers, our fathers, and our presidents. And what we see happening rather than that is a lot of talk about economic change, which is not going to improve any of this, which means that women will continue to be fighting not only for a place in the economy, but to manage all of this work near single-handedly. And that puts us in a position of vulnerability. The violence follows.
I want to two issues that Salima just raised, and if you can take the labor exploitation of women in their work environments, but also as you would have seen from that piece we played earlier, marginalization from the formal economy. We don't seem to be making the kinds of strides one would have thought that we would have made by now.
And this is definitely
sorry, that question to Nondomiso.
Oh, thank you very much. Absolutely, I think we are not making as significant as strides as we would like to. And I think Salima has just touched on the issue of care work. I was actually looking at a labor force survey that actually shows that the labor market is still far more favorable to men. And of course, while women are more likely to be doing unpaid care work. And I think it's important for us to recognize these intersections. The two speakers earlier have touched on this. I want to stress again, Vuyo, just quickly that, we all acknowledge that gender-based violence is a manifestation of persistent inequalities. And I think that the reality of the matter is we cannot talk about the economy without talking about this, economic advancement without talking about the issue of gender-based violence. So indeed, I think the reality of the matter is what we are seeing, and again, during the COVID period now, is that we've seen a lot of women losing employment, but we are also seeing a lot of women being pushed into what we call precarious work, which is work that is oftentimes not protected. And I actually want to touch on the issue of young Black women. The very same study that I'm referring to, in actual fact, shows that there's a higher representation of Black women. There's a higher unemployment rate amongst Black women in the country. And I think these are the conversations that we need to have. Salima's actually touched on the issue of care work. And I think these are the realities, that it does need to be redistributed, that a lot of women continue to experience juggling multiple roles. And she made a perfect example, of course, of during the COVID-19 pandemic, how we saw a lot of women having to take care of school kids, take care of their children, do the cooking whilst juggling work and so forth. And as a result, in actual fact, from one of our studies, we learned that a lot of women lost their jobs. And so I think it's important that as we are having discussions around building a sustainable tomorrow, that we certainly do touch on this important issue around care work. And I think we haven't given it as much attention as we should be. And I just do want to say to Salima that we're certainly looking forward to the release of the study to provide a bit more guidance, of course, and conversation around how do we tackle some of the challenges.
Professor Jongwana, this is, one would imagine, it's the kind of work that your presidential commission is or should be busying itself with, because whether we are talking about these things that both Nondumiso and Salima are mentioning, access to, health care, water, electricity, the high levels of, poverty and inequality that we are all familiar with, and which women in particular have the burden of caring, much more than us men. Are there conversation about how to, prioritize the limited resources that we have, because we know that there's going to be always that, issue put out there that as a country we don't have money. We have record high levels of unemployment. Our economy is not performing, in spite of what Stats SA said today. It's not going to get any better. So, and the state, everyone I think acknowledges that the state doesn't have the capacity to do everything, let alone throw money, at these problems. But how are the conversations going about reprioritizing the little that we have so that, we deal with all these issues, whether it's gender-based violence and femicide, whether it's poverty, it's hunger, access to healthcare, and so on?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one way of answering that, of course, it's multi-pronged, but one way of responding to your question, Rio, is that local government plays a critical role. So you mentioned earlier that it's a lot of players that need to fulfill their roles. So if I can just pick on a local government in the protection of the rights of women, if you consider, for example, the issue of human settlement and service delivery, where a family is in a shack. It's mother, father, and children. So there's spatial issues which can translate. There are psychological reports that say that can translate to personal space, because in a shack, that personal space is constantly, quote unquote, violated, for lack of a better word, or impinged upon, just literally because there is no space. So if we can, consider such issues, how they then translate to physical violence. Again, I'm not saying that people who grow up in shacks become violent, but I'm saying we should respect all citizens such that we give them decent housing so that children have the space to develop as normally as possible, and the child's rights and the child's dignity is indeed protected. So early childhood development is critical in that sense. And then there's a correlation between local government and early childhood development from the ages of 2 to 7, where brain development is critical. And issues around that time, things that children witness in that small space during that time, can translate later on in life, where if the child was in adverse hostile environment within a shack, for example.
Okay, Salima, I don't know where our time has disappeared to, but I just want to ask you something. I mean, as a researcher, do you, alongside other researchers, scholars, even you, Prof. And John, sort of get a sense that the body of work that you produce, doesn't just end up in conversation. And not only is it acknowledged, but government actually takes its cue, from the volumes of work that all of you keep on producing, but also the ideas, that come from the various, forums, like the one you were part of, Andumisa, today. In other words, this work does actually get taken seriously, but also gets into the programs and ideas that, the government forms part of. Salima?
Thank you. I want to mention the last big study that I released, which was with Women on Farms, an organization that you might all be familiar with. In that study, we put forward recommendations around precisely a question that you raised just a minute ago, Vuyo, around the state having no money to throw at these problems. We put forward a proposal there around a wealth tax in South Africa. We talk a lot about inequality in South Africa. When you think about inequality, you must remember that there are not only the many, the majority at the bottom, but there are those at the top that create the gap. So when we say the state has no money to deal with issues like the ones I raised around care, to deal with the early childhood education that the professor raised, to deal with implementing the gender-based violence strategic plan, we have to think about the very top. And when we look there, we have a lot of wealth in South Africa. If that wealth is collectivized to an extent, we can make a very moderate demand around it, right? We have a certain level of taxation around wealth. We know that 65%, for example, of housing is owned by 10% of the population. You tax some of that, you will have resources to deal with some of the issues that are affecting women and children, as much as we are crying about all the problems today on International Women's Day when we should be celebrating.
We should indeed.
We will have the resources. We have that power in this country.
Well, hopefully someone is listening. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. We're going to leave this conversation right there for this evening. Special thanks to my guests this evening, Salima Valiani, who's an author and independent researcher, Nondumiso Ntibande, who's the country director for International NGO Action Aid, and Professor Phakama Njongwana from the Nelson Mandela University, who also serves on a Presidential Social Policy Commission. And that's our show for this evening. Do have a good night, and once again, a happy International Women's Day to all the women out there. Good night.